Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you former Speaker of the House and great friend to the Reagan Foundation, Newt Gingrich. In fact, this is Speaker Gingrich's 10th appearance doing an event with the Reagan Foundation, and we look forward to having him for the next 10. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, Newt Gingrich quickly climbed his way to the upper echelons of Republican leadership by refusing to accept that Republicans were destined to be the minority in the House. He worked closely with President Reagan to bring about real, positive change in America. According to Speaker Gingrich's new book, Trump and the American Future, Solving the Great Problems of Our Time, from the spread of the coronavirus to the highs and lows of the economy and on to the election, 2020 will continue to be a process of change. He's here with us today to discuss his book and his thoughts on America. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program, coming to you from our Air Force One Pavilion Leadership Academy Oval Office with Newt Gingrich and Reagan Foundation and Institute Executive Director John Highbush.
Speaker Gingrich, just terrific to have you with us at the Reagan Library. As you know, we originally had planned to have you live and in person, as we have so many times. I want you to know, when this pandemic is behind us and you're able to travel and things can be safe again, we still would love to have you out at the Reagan Library again with your new book or the next one you write. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Let me say, first of all, that I am a huge fan of the Reagan Library, and particularly the educational work you do and the way that you create learning experiences for young people. And I cannot remember a time Callista and I visited that we did not have just a wonderful experience. So I can assure you, as soon as I'm allowed to get back to the West Coast, I will be dropping into Simi Valley.
Terrific. Love to have you, Mr. Speaker, and Ambassador Gingrich as well. So I've known you for years. You are an intellectual, you are a historian, you're an imaginative guy. I wonder, though, Mr. Speaker, could you have ever imagined a situation like the world and the United States finds itself in today? Did you ever imagine a pandemic and literally stopping the world in its tracks during your lifetime?
No, and I think when I first started writing Trump and the American Future, it was at the peak of great economics, lowest Black unemployment in modern history, lowest Latino unemployment. Everything was going well. We were negotiating toughly with the Chinese, but it seemed rational. And then boom, you start with what originally was the Chinese virus, now given a different name for political reasons. Then you go to the first time I've ever seen countries deliberately create a depression. Then you go to politicians deciding what you can and can't do. Then you go to people being totally fed up, weeks isolated, worried economically, and you have the tragic death of George Floyd, and all of a sudden the country seems to come apart at the seams. So if you had asked me, could I have imagined putting all of that together, I think the answer is no. I don't think I've written a bunch of novels. I don't know that I would have had the imagination to put them on. I'm not sure. People would have said it wasn't believable. And of course, you also had impeachment in the middle of that. and you have all sorts of things. The level of turmoil in some ways resembles the late 1960s, except that the left is better organized and more totalitarian now than it was in the late 60s, but very similar kind of turmoil.
Yeah, in fact, you know, you mentioned the 60s as a decade. I was trying to think back, Newt, to what's the closest experience that America has had in the last century to what we're facing today? And you know, when the pandemic initially arrived, people were comparing the halting the economy to the 2007, 2008 period. But as I thought about it, I thought, you know, and I wanted your view on this, whether or not you think it's been since World War II and the attack on Pearl Harbor and a nation literally mobilized in a very different way, of course, but I think that might be the closest experience we've had to the present day.
Yeah,
Can you think
I think that's right. I have written things both for publication and for the White House saying that this is the largest mobilization effort since World War II. And in fact, I wrote a piece which turned out to be unusually impactful because I was over here in Italy. And so I had seen this building for about 6 weeks before Washington did. And I wrote a piece and said, you know, whatever you're planning to do, triple it, because you don't understand yet how big this is going to get. And I think that was probably, apparently people read it because they knew I was here and actually changed the conversation and led us to the very, very large bills that they passed in the effort to sort of stabilize the economy. But it's a really, I think, big challenge right now. And I think it's compounded because we are probably as politically divided as we've been in a long time. I have a good friend who's a Civil War historian at Princeton who says that the language used to attack Trump resembles the slave-owning newspapers in South Carolina attacking Lincoln in 1860. So the level of vitriol and the nastiness and the degree of hatred is really unlike, even with Theodore or Franklin Roosevelt, you never got the depth of kind of things you're getting about Trump. And that of course all feeds into this whole ability to how do you mobilize a country where the country itself is deeply split. And a lot of people, as we found, a lot of people all of a sudden decided that, you know, you didn't have to worry about social distancing as long as you were ideologically pure and doing the right thing. So, you know, it's a very strange, very complicated time.
Yeah, in fact, a core theme, it seems to me, of your newest book, Newt, is that America finds itself in a cultural civil war. And I know you too are a civil war historian. I wonder if you can, explain that to us.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well,
exactly?
actually, I just recently wrote a newsletter entitled 3 Generations of Brainwashing. And the core of the newsletter is Reagan's farewell address, where he says the one thing he most deeply regrets is not being able to institutionalize teaching patriotism in American history, and that he's really worried that we are losing the ability to talk to ourselves about who we are, and that if that happens, that the country gradually starts to disappear. And I think that he was exactly, when you go back and you read it, you realize he gave this in January of 1989. He's amazingly prescient about where we are today. Partly, I suspect, because as governor of California, he had dealt with Marcuse and with the radicals at Berkeley. So he had a pretty good instinct for how bad it was going to be. But we're clearly in a cultural civil war. I mean, you clearly have people who have accepted a Lenin, Stalin, Maoist view of how to organize and how to treat other people. You clearly have people who despise America. As Mark Thiessen wrote recently, when you refuse to stand for the national anthem, it's not because you're repudiating racism, it's because you're repudiating the United States. And you have a lot of that. You have a surprisingly large number of people today. It's almost like the radical generation of the 60s has now had almost 50 years to grow and strengthen and gather more force. And so in that sense, I think we are in a very deep cultural war, which will in many ways have a huge effect on what kind of country we become over the next half century.
Yeah, in fact, I looked pretty closely, and I think that you turned the book into your publisher early mid-March. It was just
Right.
as the pandemic had struck in a major way, and so this book was written pre-George Floyd. So
Yes.
we
do have a chapter in there on poverty, and a chapter on the failure of the big cities that relates to this. We probably don't have as strong a chapter as we should have on the question of race in America. But again, I'd already had to redo the book once for COVID and once for the self-imposed depression. So it was pretty wild. It's the most complicated book I've ever written.
It's a magnificent book, Mr. Speaker. Really, you cover the waterfront. I mean, it's just amazing. Especially, I mean, it's a terrific book all the way around. But the back half of the book, I mean, my gosh, you cover all the ground. It's just great to see it. I bet you, had you written the book or finished it next week, for example, you would double down on your thinking about this being a cultural civil war because of the addition of this whole
Sure.
issue over racism and George Floyd, right?
Well, actually, I do podcasts every week at Gingrich 360, and which are free, and I do newsletters, 3 newsletters a week. And I've done a series recently on exactly this. But I would say for me, maybe a sign that I'm too much of an intellectual, the really big moment was when the New York Times reporters forced the firing of their editor because he had published an op-ed by a conservative senator. And I thought, if we'd gotten to a point of tyranny on the left, where one conservative opinion piece in a virtually totally left-wing newspaper was such an act of heresy that the man who admitted it had to be basically fired. I mean, get rid of him. And then I watched a principal in Vermont, in a town that is 97% white, who tweeted, "Shouldn't all lives matter?" And the following day she was fired. And then in your part of the woods, there was a professor at UCLA who actually read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail and was then suspended. Now, how it could offend somebody in the left to read King's letter, which of course is about nonviolence and is about the American dream. And King was very much saying to America, you have to live up to the great dream you have, not I want to repudiate America. And you look at all that and you just think, this is truly a cultural civil war. Then, you know, Black Lives Matter is popular right now because it's a slogan. But when you actually look at the organization, which has as one of its explicit goals, the destruction of the nuclear family. Now, why they want to destroy the nuclear family, I'm not sure. It strikes me as irrational socially and a guaranteed step towards weakness, but it's in there. I mean, you know, and you realize that the people who founded Black Lives Matter are inherently anti-American in the sense that they want a totally different America and they want to replace the America that exists today. The other example is the congresswoman from Minnesota who's Somali by background. How you can leave Mogadishu for Minneapolis and have a grudge rather than gratitude, I think is one of the great things worth studying. You know, she left a society which is a disaster, dominated by warlords, people starving, no sense of individual opportunity, a very oppressive behavior for women, to come to the freest, most open society in the world. And she's angry. Now, and I sort of look at all that and I don't get it. You'd think that it's, and in fact, I'd be curious if somebody I'm trying to get a friend of mine who lives out there to go to ask her, does she really think Mogadishu is better than Minneapolis? Because she behaves like we've somehow done her a terrible injustice by making her be an American.
What do you think, of course, a conversation, a debate, a discussion about the issues of racism are, of course, important. I wonder what you think about the evolution of the argument on the left, though, now, where this new phrase is coined, systemic racism. It's this concept of, well, you're racist, but you just don't know it.
First of all, I think you have to acknowledge that African Americans, more than any other group, experience slights. I've had very famous African Americans tell me. And Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, in introducing the bill on police reform, said, I think he was stopped 6 times last year. And he's a US senator. So I think in that sense, we have to start by acknowledging that it is more challenging to be Black and that there are inherent difficulties you have to overcome. The question then becomes, and I think it's a really simple test, which I'm going to be writing about, and that is it more important for Blacks to succeed or for whites to feel guilty? Now, for some bizarre reason, the left has decided that white guilt, and announcing that you're guilty, feeling bad about being guilty, taking a knee to prove you're guilty, somehow achieves things. And I said in an interview with NPR yesterday, I'd be a lot more sympathetic to all of the multimillionaire NFL players who want to take a knee if they each went out and founded a charter school and actually helped children succeed. But I'm totally unimpressed by people who America have made into millionaires, who now want to impose on the rest of us their particular viewpoint. And so I think we need a conversation. And the nice thing about the left is they can't contain themselves. And because they own the news media, they have no feedback mechanism to say you're nuts. So for example, the California Assembly just passed by 56-5, creating a commission on reparations, which is the #1 goal of the Black Caucus in the California legislature. Well, reparations is both morally and mechanically hopeless. And it's a fight that the left will lose badly, but they just have to do it. They can't stop themselves. Pelosi's $3 trillion bill includes paying $1,200 per person to every illegal immigrant in the United States as part of the stimulus. Now, that's overreach on a scale which I suspect 75 or 80% of the country will disagree with. And they just go through item after item like this. So if they had some ability to be self-disciplined, they'd probably be dramatically more dangerous than they are.
I got a galley copy of the book, Mr. Speaker, and I think your title was initially Trump and the American Future, Building a Better American Future. And as the book hits the shelves, I think you changed the title, updated it to Solving the Great Problems of Our Time. Tell me why the shift there?
Because I felt as I looked at all the things that were emerging, that we needed to shift towards a more open problem solving. I think in the world before the pandemic and before the Depression, it was easier to imagine Trump really continuing to solve things at a rate that was amazing. Now we're in a situation so complicated and with so many different unknown parts that I think we're all going to have to pitch in to solve things. I don't think Trump by himself can be the solution. I think he can lead the solution, but it's going to take millions of Americans to get us out of the ditch that we're now in.
I know you've commented on this before because you're a historian, but now we seem to see an acceleration of this phenomena, and that is that the left believes we can improve the future by destroying the past. This rush to pull down not just Civil War monuments, but monuments of American presidents, the revolution, kind of comment on that and what's happening in America today on that front.
Well, I mean, again, I think part of this is where maybe having, part of the reason I wrote the recent article on the 3 generations of brainwashing is it hit me that we have lots of people who are so badly educated, they don't understand how much they're simply out, they're doing a street dance we've done before. We've had the French Revolution. We've had the Russian Revolution of 1917. We've had Maoism. I mean, we know how these things work. If they could read not just 1984, but they could read Animal Farm. And they would understand what Orwell, who had been a Trotskyite, was actually in the Trotsky Brigade in the Spanish Civil War when Stalin decided to wipe it out. So he'd seen up close, and then he had, of course, Mussolini and he had Hitler. And it's very significant that he puts 1984 in Britain. He's not describing Moscow. He's saying, look, the tendency of this society will be to create a totally false story, to then have a memory hole into which we will put everything that doesn't fit the story, and we will reserve the right for the state to change the story whenever it wants to. Well, that's what these people are doing. Where does it start? Where does it stop? For example, should the suffragettes, probably almost all of whom believed in traditional marriage, therefore have their statues pulled down because they weren't adequately sensitive to what 100 years later would emerge as a gay rights movement. The idea that Washington, who more than any other single person, created the framework within which people could say that their rights came from God and not from the king, or that Jefferson, who actually wrote the words, that these people are anything less than historically astonishing figures who advance the cause of human freedom, is an absurdity. But what you're dealing with is a mob. The mob has no mind. It has emotion. And it doesn't understand that it's beginning to set up patterns that are totally unacceptable. And I think very, very dangerous. And by the way, in Seattle, Washington, in the middle of all of this new purity, there is a 7-foot-tall statue of Lenin, which was put there years and years ago. Some guy bought it when it was being thrown away at the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, I don't object to Lenin being there because I think it's a great opportunity to teach people what a monster he was and how many people's lives were destroyed by him. But, as a conservative, if they get to knock down Jefferson, can I knock down Lenin? And then you just look at that stuff and think this is crazy. But it's both an act of cultural warfare and it's an act of proving that they have the energy and the drive and the courage to rebel. So you have to see it as both things coming together. And I think it's a very, very dangerous pattern. But again, it goes back to this idea that for 3 generations, we've told people things that are lies. Reagan once said, it isn't what they don't know that is so troubling, it's what they know that isn't true. And I think that's what we're seeing today.
Yeah. I'd like to touch for just a second on Russia, meddling in the election and the rest of that. I think that, President Trump would make the point that he won fair and square, whether, Russia set up a few Facebook sites and that sort of thing. It's fairly irrelevant. But I wonder if you think, Newt, that at the present time with America in this cultural civil war, if, without knowing it at present, if the Russias of the world are intentionally stoking these fires and trying to set Americans against themselves.
Oh, I think they are if they can. Look, there's a very long historic tradition of countries meddling in other countries. And we've been the dominant country now for a long enough period that there are people who naturally resent us and would like to, knock us off. I fear the Chinese more than I fear the Russians. Both of them, I suspect, are involved. I went back, it's really interesting. I went back and read Clark Clifford's 44-page memo for Harry Truman. He wrote it in 1947, outlining the 48 campaigns. It's an amazing document. He routinely will talk about communists. This was before the so-called Red Scare. He'll say, oh, this union's communist dominated, or that mayor is a communist. And it's just, that's where it was. I mean, he wasn't doing anything about it necessarily, but it's easy for us to forget that in the 30s, there was enough Nazi penetration that the House Un-American Activities Committee originally was set up to go after the Nazis, not the communists. And then after World War II, there was enough communist penetration that they were going after the communists. And then we were told, you're not allowed to do that. And so we then had to lie about whether or not there were any communists. And of course, one of the reasons Reagan got into politics was his awareness that there were communists in the Screen Actors Guild. So I look at all of that, and I think that they can try to interfere. They might be able in some ways. I mean, one of the things you have to worry about if we centralize elections is it makes theft easier. I mean, right now, elections are run down at the county level, and it's chaotic, and it has huge disadvantages, but it's really hard to rig because it's just too decentralized. Now, on the other hand, messages on Twitter or Facebook or what have you, or ads, or they have a Russian TV station whose total penetration is not very much. They have, I don't think there's a comparable Chinese station, although there are Chinese newspapers. But I just think it's the nature of the modern world. And this, of course, was a huge fight as early as Washington's administration, when the French sent some people over to try to get us to be anti-British. And it blew up because people just didn't want foreigners interfering with the American system. So we've had a long history of that. I think it's good that the administration has set up teams to work on this. I think that we have in Bill Barr an amazingly competent attorney general, and a very serious and dedicated patriot. And I suspect we'll be okay on that front. I worry much more about Democrats stealing the election as they do in California with vote harvesting than I do about the Chinese or the Russians.
Is it fair to say, Newt, that pre-pandemic, you likely felt that this race in 2020 was President Trump's to lose, but now maybe not so much? Is he really got a real fight on his hands?
Yeah, I think when I first set out to write the book, I thought that Trump had a very substantial advantage. And I would have said at the time that my expectation was he'd win, and he'd win by a big margin. I think now it's up in the air, but I think it depends in part on what happens. If the economy starts to come back enough that people feel like they see hope, then I think the president has a huge opportunity to win. If the economy stumbles and it feels like whatever Trump's magic was, that he ain't got it anymore, then I think there's a problem. The challenge for the Democrats is, I did a newsletter the other day on Biden, Schumer, Pelosi as a machine. And I said, this is not an election between President Trump and President Biden. It's an election between President Trump and a machine, of which Biden is the weakest of the three. And so a number of friends wrote me or called me and said that it really scared them. Then you start thinking about what Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer would be like in a room with nobody, no supervision. It would be wild. And so I think for the moment, it's truly ironic. Biden is a candidate who is so weak that the longer he can hide, the better off he is. And so I think it's the morning he starts campaigning, if he ever does, it will be so painful to watch his inability to function that I think he could melt pretty quickly.
You made a point in the book Newt, that President Trump made a bet, and that is that his use of social media could beat the news media. And, he's been at it now in that war, in using those tactics for several years. Do you think that technology is such today that, his grasp on social media, still gives him an advantage over a unified media on the left, or are we seeing, as a result of all this cultural war, a balancing of that power?
Well, I think without the social media, Trump would have been driven off the field. I mean, this is a guy, remember that as early as, I think, the summer of 16, people were writing columns that say, we might have to impeach him. On the day he was sworn in, the Washington Post had an article about whether or not Trump would be impeached. So he has had 92 or 93% hostility every single day from winning the election to today. If he had not had a huge social media base, he'd have been broken. As it is, he actually has a slight advantage. He doesn't just fight him to a standstill. He's gotten a lot more people thinking about fake news than I would have thought likely 2 or 3 years ago. Cliff and I had the experience of going up to Turin, which has the second largest Egyptian collection outside of Egypt, for strange reasons. But anyway, so we got a guide to take us through this museum. And we're going through one of the halls, and he points to a statue. And he says, people will tell you X, but that's fake news. And I found myself thinking, wait a second, I have an Italian guide in an Egyptian museum using Donald Trump's language. Now that's cultural impact. And so I would say that, I wish he was a little more disciplined, and I wish he probably deleted at least 10% of his tweets before he sent them. But having said that, his ability to keep pounding away, I think, has saved his presidency, and he would have been crushed in a pre-information age environment, because the media hates him at a level I've never seen any candidate faced with the level of hostility that Trump has to live with every day.
It's an interesting point that you make, Newt, about Trump's his style of pounding away, just relentlessly, always counterpunching, whether counterpunching up or down. I mean, that's how he plays it. Do you think that the left has learned something from that? I get the sense that they have become as relentless in the attack as well.
Oh, but I think they were already were, period. I think it's who they are. It's what they did to Jerry Ford. Remember, Ford slips or hits his head getting off Air Force One, and that becomes a relentless series of jokes. I think there are two different stories to Trump, though, that you touched on and blended together. One is he believes in counterpunching, and I think he learned that by coexisting with Page 6 in New York. I think that he learned early on that every time they'd hit him, he'd hit them. And as long as he did that, he was getting lots of publicity. Because remember, in the early days, he's a relatively unknown young real estate guy. And he wants to rise, he wants to get known. Manhattan is probably as tough an environment as there is for doing that. So one part is this deeply held belief that you always counterpunch. But the other part is that he's a genius at branding. You go back to his first book, The Art of the Deal, which was a bestseller for years and years and years. You look at how many Trump towers, Trump hotels, Trump golf courses. At one time, I went to see him before he was a candidate, and he gave me several Trump ties and said that the reason they were successful is they're about 2 inches longer than most ties, and so Americans are big people and so forth. But you may remember he once did this entire shtick where late, I think it was late in the campaign, where Romney had said something about Trump's not really a business guy. So he brings in Trump steaks, Trump water, spends like 25 minutes bringing products up. And he had the #1 TV show, which was stayed on the air for, I think, 13 years. So I would say he understands relentlessly positive, optimistic branding. And that's The Apprentice and the Trump ties and so forth. And he understands counterpunching, but they're actually different patterns. They happen to fit together, but they're very different patterns.
Instincts. Let's talk about Trump's instincts for a minute. You have worked with, up close, a number of American presidents. Trump seems to me to be in a class all his own from the standpoint of governing, actually running, operating the federal bureaucracy and environment purely through instinct. I know there are processes and papers are written and briefings and the rest of that, but he seems to govern, learn, educate, decide purely by instinct. That's often saved him. He's often done quite well by that, as you know. I wonder if it's sustainable.
Well, we're going to find out in about 5 months. I would say that the president he's the most like is Andrew Jackson, in that Jackson was both a populist and a disruptor. Jackson had an extraordinarily strong personality, once shot a man off the balcony of the White House. Jackson was, I think, very hard to manage because he followed his own inner instincts. So in many ways, I see Trump as a Jacksonian type figure. But the other thing to remember, which is really, I'm frankly very deeply impressed with Trump as a person. Reagan had 8 years as governor of California. Clinton had something like 12 years as governor, or 10 years as governor of Arkansas. George Herbert Walker Bush had been vice president for 8 years. George W. Bush had been governor for 8 years. Obama grew up in politics, served in the state legislature, understood the game. Trump is a business guy. He has opinions, but he doesn't have policies. He runs a very small shop. It has lots of people out around the world, but the actual core Trump enterprises is very small. He really doesn't have the kind of depth of background to learn how you run big systems. And I think he's getting better and better at it. But the first couple of years were pretty chaotic, and he didn't understand the legislature. And frankly, his instinct was right and theirs was wrong. He was told by the Republican leaders in the Congress that they could repeal Obamacare and that's the first thing they should do. And of course, they lost by 1 vote when McCain voted no. And what he should have done is started with the tax bill. And in fact, I would have argued, do the tax bill first, then do infrastructure, then you can consider Obamacare. But they carried him down this fantasy line, and I think he learned from that his instincts were better than theirs. And that's the other thing to remember. And it's why people like John Bolton go nuts and other people who are never Trumpers. Trump is a genuinely disruptive figure who came in from the outside, determined to change things. Well, everybody who has a big investment in the old order is going to be terrified and offended and, say, how can you do this? Well, that's what he was elected to do. That's why he won. And I think that's what, so in many ways, when he's living out what is his commitment that got him elected, the more traditional members of the establishment are deeply offended both by his language and by the risk-taking, and, you know. But in fact, he's pretty shrewd and he's pretty clever.
You know, I often get asked the question, Newt, compare Ronald Reagan with Donald Trump. And I often I go back to thinking of the times that, you know, Reagan was in the White House. And it's, I visualize Reagan as a boxer, you know, Reagan as a prize fighter when boxing was popular in America. Trump, on the other hand, seems to me that he's MMA. This is gloves off. This is really, really tough stuff. What do you think of that? Do you buy that comparison?
I wouldn't have thought of it quite that way. I think that Reagan had a remarkable sense of playing a role. I think it was the role of a lifetime. And I think that he had an instinctive belief, really grown out of sort of an Eisenhower type tradition, of what the president should be like. Which is why, for example, he'd never take his coat off in the Oval Office. A good friend of mine had dinner with him just before he was sworn in. He had a very bold idea, and which would have shaken the system up radically. And after the dinner, Paul Weyrich was his name, and after the dinner, Reagan turned to him and said, "Paul, that's really a very interesting idea, but I wear the white hat." You know, you'd have to have a guy who wears the black hat do something like that. So I think Reagan in a way, he had a real sense of his limitations. And then he knew how to build his strengths while minimizing his limitations. He also had acquired, I think, a disciplined pleasantness. That reminds me a little of FDR, who had a huge level of discipline. And that Reagan was almost always pleasant. But people had made a real mistake if they thought that there was softness under the pleasantness, because he was actually very tough and very willing to do what he believed in. The other thing I'd say is that Reagan really began moving to the right after his drinks with the Stalinists and the Screen Actors Guild in '47. And then all through the 50s, both as an anti-communist and increasingly because of Nancy's father on taxes and other issues, and the guy who hired him at General Electric, because Reagan, as you remember, wouldn't fly. So this guy, he did 375 speeches for General Electric, and he would always go by train. And so this guy would always give him conservative economic books to read on the train, because Reagan didn't drink much and he didn't play cards. So Reagan evolved into being very, very thoughtful. Trump is not just a real estate guy. He's not a finance guy. He's a construction guy. So Trump is very comfortable hanging out. There's a great series on YouTube. They must have made it in the 90s of Trump at one of his hotels doing every job. So at one point he's dressed up as the guy who greets you at the door, and he walks a dog for the lady, and he comes back and she says, "Oh, that's really great. My dog's so happy." And he looks at her and goes, "Do I get a tip?" I mean, it's just, but he's cleaning rooms with the maids. He's checking people in, you know, and he was having the time of his life. But there was a non-intellectual, relaxed happiness about Trump, he's very existential in a way that Reagan was not. Reagan was very long-term and had a very good sense of history. Trump really is in the moment. Now, he's really, really smart, and he's getting better pretty fast. And it's not that he's simplistic, but that he tries to find core principles and then operates off of those principles over and over and over again. And sometimes you can't figure out, I mean, I always figure out with presidents, every president, it's my job to understand them. And so I'm always trying to figure out, if they do something, I don't start with, boy, that was dumb. I start with, what is it they thought they were doing? And with Reagan, you had a lot of very long-term, I'm going to move the system, I'm going to defeat the Soviet Empire. With Trump, you get a lot more sort of daily opportunism.
Whether Trump is in office 4 more months or 4 more years, as you say, Newt, you are a real student of the presidency, and I wonder if there's 1 or 2 things that you feel that Trump has perhaps forever changed about the presidency, given his style and how he's carried himself.
I actually doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is, again, to go back to Andrew Jackson, I mean, there's certain people who just fill the room. And, the next person ain't going to fill the room the same way. Almost certainly whoever succeeds Trump, whether it's in next January or 4 years later, will be more managerial, will be more organizable, will have better staff work. All of which are things which would simply cripple Trump. It's not what he needs, it's not what he wants. So my first instinct is to say, I don't think that he will have significantly changed the presidency. I think he will have significantly changed the country. And if he gets 4 more years, I think that'll be bigger. And in some ways, he's probably done some good. I mean, for example, the National Security Council now has been shrunk back to a pre-Obama size, and that's probably good. But in a lot of ways, the machinery just runs, and it's going to run under Trump or it's going to run under somebody else.
Last question, and you cover this extensively in your new book. Has nothing to do with Trump. It just has everything to do with China. I mean, this is overstating it, but I mean, do you see us literally at war someday with China because of the direction everything is going? And I don't necessarily mean some terrible thermonuclear war, but it just seems to me conflict seems almost inevitable with.
We just saw the Chinese kill 20 Indian soldiers for no particularly good reason. I assume they were sending a signal to New Delhi about something. We just saw the North Koreans blow up the only diplomatic mission site they had with South Korea, which I think is frankly pretty alarming. The challenge we have, and this is part of why last year I wrote Trump versus China, because I had found I had made some significant mistakes in analyzing China. And as I began to understand the mistakes, my whole interpretation changed. I've been looking at China since 1960. And it's one of the reasons I worry about things like the New York Times rebellion. The Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist, Stalinist party, consciously so. Deng Xiaoping spent a year at Lenin University in Moscow. When Khrushchev's secret speech attacked Stalin in '56, the Chinese were horrified because Stalin was their great leader and they believed in him. They couldn't understand why, Khrushchev would do heresy. Xi Jinping is the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. That's the base of his power. He is the chairman of the Military Commission of the People's Liberation Army, which is the military wing of the party, not the government. It's not a government army. And he's president of China, which is his least important job. Now, when you understand that, and you understand that in their mind, they have left a century of humiliation and are once again becoming the Central Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom. It's very formidable. You have 1,300,000,000 people who work hard and they're smart. They don't follow any rules that we understand. So if they can cheat and steal, they will. It's caveat emptor, in gigantic bold type. Let the buyer beware, because if we can steal from you, we will, and it's your fault for not having stopped us from stealing. So shame on you. And I think that's what we're up against. And I can imagine both a flashpoint, particularly over Taiwan or the South China Sea, where you would have real exchange of combat. I would worry about it escalating on both sides, because whichever side was losing would be tempted to go up the escalation ladder just because they'd be so shocked at losing. But I think it's the most difficult challenge for us to try to think about how do we get to a world 40 or 50 years from now where we have contained China with minimum conflict, but they have not been allowed to dominate. And I think that's one of the most important questions we have to ask over the next few years.
Yeah, perhaps the question of our time. Mr. Speaker, it's been a delight to have you with us. Thank you so much. Thank you for writing yet another.
I want to thank you, John, for your leadership, and I want to thank your team for their collective leadership. The Reagan Library is a national treasure. It's an extraordinary institution. Every American should visit it. And if they have kids and grandkids, they should make sure they get there. And I'm just so grateful that you have been dedicated to conveying the spirit of Ronald Reagan. And I think in that sense, you have created a real building block of our future that gives us hope that we will continue to be a unique country.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again for being with us. Our best to Callista, and stay safe there.
I'll do it. Thank you. Thanks, John. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.